For better or worse, the release of Fire Emblem Sword of Seals in 2002 very much reinvented the Fire Emblem franchise artistically, mechanically, and narratively. This was a necessary development as the creator of the series, our old friend Shozo Kaga, left Intelligent Systems after completing Thracia 776 to work on his own games. Thus, at the very least, a new director and writer were needed for this latest installment. The chief programmer from Genealogy and Thracia would become the director of the project, and 3 new writers were brought on to fill Kaga's shoes. And for the most part, the series came out better after the transition, but there are unavoidable problems that crop up due to the division of labor that we'll see as we get into the game. The most immediately noticeable change in Sword of Seals is in the aesthetic department. The 90s anime style of Genealogy and Thracia received a modern facelift for the character portraits and cutscenes, and some fantastic sprite art for the combat portions. Even if they do lose a bit of the dynamism of characters advancing, retreating, having a unique animation for consecutive attacks, and generally looking like they're fighting, there is a bit more detail to the sprites, and it did finally get rid of the silly crab walk thing the fighters do in earlier games. Not to mention that some of the animations are just downright cool. It also allowed for some real variety in the maps, with locations ranging from volcanoes, to snowy mountains, to underground ruins. Gameplay-wise, Sword of Seals introduced a whole slew of mechanical changes, while still managing to keep the core mechanics and overall feel of Fire Emblem intact. Most significantly, a second RNG was added that calculated away in the background, complicating the combat even further, and doing away with the what you see is what you get style of previous iterations. While some might consider this obfuscation a negative, I think of it as a good thing, because it makes the fighting more like actual combat, in which you don't go in knowing exactly what's going to happen in advance. You cross your fingers and hope for the best. It adds a bit of unpredictability to the mix, even if it is sometimes frustrating. Units were also no longer bound to a single type of weapon. Cavaliers, for example, could use both swords and lances from level 1, and the promoted paladins gained the use of axes as well, giving units more control over the weapon's triangle, while at the same time introducing weapons that reverse the triangle and hit for critical damage in the right situations. In the same vein, weapon levels and the ability to raise them through use were introduced, which improved accuracy and critical strike chance with the type of weapon as the level rose. Sword of Seals also boasted the largest roster of playable characters yet, a whopping 54 as opposed to Genealogy's 24 in Generation 1 and 25 in Generation 2. However, Sword of Seals reuses Thracia's unit restrictions, often limiting the player to somewhere around 10 to 14 units per map, so many characters will unfortunately be left out. Character development was further explored with the introduction of the support system, in which characters positioned next to each other for some time could trigger a bit of text focusing on the relationship between the two, and also an increase in stats when fighting near each other. A character in Sword of Seals could have a maximum of 3 chats with any other, but was limited to 5 total to prevent game-breaking stat increases, and also encourage replayability. It's often said that restraints foster creativity, and we do see some interesting characters develop over the course of just 3 conversations. Lou, for example, manages to have compelling exchanges in many of his conversations. His chat with Melody, I think, is one of the better ones, in which he starts off simply fascinated by her wyvern, but when he asks where she's from, and she hesitantly says Bern, Lou goes silent and runs away, Bern being the reason that he and his brother are orphans. However, Lou eventually returns and tells his story to Melody, and says that he won't stop hating Bern, but recognizes that although Melody is from Bern, she's also an ally and a friend. Although it's simple, I like this exchange because with his curiosity and the silent treatment, Lou acts very much like a kid, albeit a very mature kid given his revelation, but it comes off as genuine when we get his story. He's a kid who's had to grow up much too early due to the war. Sword of Seals dials back the admittedly odd love angle a bit as well. Indeed, only the protagonist marries and few characters stay with each other at the end of the game regardless of their support levels. The support system does create issues though. Without support conversations, and with the unit restrictions on maps, some characters end up saying very little, and some, like Wolt and OJ, may only have a single line, and henceforth take up space in the player's army with no way to engage them other than pairing them up with someone else. Furthermore, some conversations feel curiously distant from the more pressing issues at hand. Clarine, for example, seems oblivious to the fact that there's a war going on despite being captured by one of the antagonists, while others fight to become strong, with no real reason to do so. On a broader level, the conversations all feel a bit samey, in that they conclude with the characters having come to some understanding or realization to satisfy a character arc. Not that an arc isn't important, but many end up feeling contrived, with the hopeful, saccharine, or otherwise happy endings for every character. As far as the overarching narrative is concerned, Sword of Seals introduces players to its entirely new world with an ominous prologue describing the Scouring, a battle between dragons and humans in which the dragons were defeated and driven from the continent, and concludes with a sinister 1,000 years later. We're then taken to the present day, in which the King of Bern, Zephiel, has already invaded 2 of the other nations and is preparing to march on a 3rd, the country from which our protagonist, Roy, hails. The plot revolves around learning more about Zephiel and his motivation for starting the war and the mysterious return of the dragons. Sword of Seal's opening few scenes really work, because Roy and the player are only told what they need to know. Roy's father Eliwood is sick, and Roy is to assume command of the Farian military and head for the front to join with the main Lycian army and oppose Bern. And at this point we know just what any regular person would know: the history of the countries and that there's a war going on. We don't gain insight into Zephiel's motivation or learn of the power struggle in Etruria. Vari's reactionary position in the war and slapdash assemblage makes sense, as nobody, not even the player, knows what's going on at that point. Compare it to Genealogy's history book style, in which we're immediately told who everybody is, who's allied, who's feeling betrayed, and how tumultuous the coming battles are going to be. And although I genuinely like it, and it works well in Genealogy, the style does create a bit of distance between the game and the player, as opposed to Sword of Seals, in which the player is little more involved in the story. Things get sloppy, though, in Chapter 3, when we're introduced to some of the antagonists, which is where Sword of Seals feels most awkward. King Zephiel and General Narshan are both so uncompromisingly evil that it's difficult to take them seriously as characters. We see that Narshan's lieutenants are more afraid of him than they are of the Lycian army, and we see that Zephiel tolerates no insubordination whatsoever. And, as if the player still hadn't gotten the point, they have a brief discussion about how it's okay to kill women and children. Narshan seems to have no reason to act in such a way, and very little else is ever revealed about him other than that he's vain. And Zephiel gives a cryptic motivation of wanting to liberate the world, which, although he gives a reason for it at the close of the game, strikes me as a very childish one. He wants to restore control of the world to the dragons because people are bad, mentioning things like his father's jealousy and his sister's betrayal. But this doesn't really make sense either. His father is dead, so he's not bothering him anymore. And if Guinevere had betrayed him before he started the war, it would seem like something that could push him over the edge and perhaps provide motivation for his warmongering. But she stayed with him until he invaded Lycia. So what was the motivation before? Not only this, but later we see allies of Lycia like Eric turncoat for apparently no reason. He doesn't mention anything about being concerned for the future livelihood of his country, or perhaps concern for the citizens, or even any personal motives. He simply says that he's against tradition? Not to mention the fact that no one seems overly concerned with this betrayal, or leaving a Lycian territory without a marquise. Roy just offs him and is done with it. As if that wasn't enough, Sword of Seals also borrows significantly from Genealogy, most notably in that it portrays children fighting what is ultimately their parents' battle, although we wouldn't know that until later. But it also recycles several plot points as well. Not long into the game, Roy meets the next in line to the enemy's throne and proceeds to travel with them. The protagonist leads an impulsive skirmish to rescue a childhood friend. We're told of the deified founders of the nations and their legendary weapons that can only be wielded by their successors, and the role that those weapons play in the final chapters. Ultimately, although Sword of Seals is a bit lazy on the narrative and the characters, it's evident that the focus of the game was elsewhere, particularly on the series' transition to the Game Boy Advance, and the improved art and mechanics that would come with it. And I can appreciate that, as Sword of Seals added a great deal to Fire Emblem, improving the game in what I think are significant ways. But for better or worse, it also provided a framework for several Fire Emblem games to come. Next time we'll be taking a look at Blazing Sword. I'll see you then.